Hello, everyone. I'm Eliane Balijuro. I'm the Executive Director of Sustainability in the Digital Age and the Global Hub Director in Canada for Future Earth. Thank you for joining us today for this session organized by UK Research and Innovation and the International Development Research Centre, IDRC. And this session is on equitable partnerships for climate change adaptation in a changing world. This dynamic panel brings together a mix of experts and perspectives from Canada, the UK, and Africa to highlight and discuss approaches and solutions to climate change adaptation in a changing world, which is key to building back better from the pandemic. This is very topical with COP26 having just been taken place in early November and climate change adaptation being at the heart of the discussions. The panel will cover issues such as the importance of international collaboration to address climate change adaptation, opportunities and challenges to finding solutions and considerations of cross-cutting policy areas, and the role of different sectors in this space, including research funders. There will be an opportunity to ask the panel questions later in the session. So I'm going to ask all the panelists to introduce themselves and provide a brief statement on their areas of expertise. And I would like to start with Mark.
Hello, my name's Mark Pelling. I'm a researcher in... Hello, sorry about that. My name's Mark Pelling. I'm a researcher in climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction, and have also, for the last couple of years, was seconded into UKRI's Global Challenges Research Fund. So was involved in quite an extensive program of engagements with many actors in preparation for the COP. So we'll reflect a little bit on those conversations as well as my own experience. Thank you.
Susan?
Thanks, Eliane. So I'm Susan Waldron. I work for NERC, which is the UK's Natural Environmental Research Council. I'm the director of an area called Research and Skills. So effectively, I oversee the investment that we make into research. And we have an area of strategic research that we invest about $92 million in a year. And this is research which is very much about diagnosing environmental problems and trying to find solutions. And clearly, the Natural Environmental Research Council is very concerned about finding solutions to adaptation and resilience. My own academic background is as a geologist, and before I joined NERC, I worked very much on the carbon cycle and looking at movement of carbon from one reservoir to another. So I actually have an interest in understanding how carbon in the atmosphere may be changing from a research perspective as well. Thank you, Eliane.
Susan. Lancelot?
Thank you, Eliane, and good morning, everyone. Good morning also everyone who is watching us online. So my name is Lancelot Theode. I'm communication and media advisor working for the International Center for Development Regional Office for Central and West Africa, Senegal. And my background is social science, but I'm here with my cap of communicator and knowledge broker, bringing also my perspective on how critical it is to make sure that all the research that is produced also reach those who need it the most. So I'm really happy to be part of this panel and look forward to share my perspective. Thank you, Eliane.
That's what Lancelot. And Catherine?
Hi, everyone. My name is Catherine Vincent. I am a geographer and the director of a specialist adaptation consultancy called Kalima Integrated Development Solutions based in South Africa. And I work in Africa and Asia conducting applied research, doing technical consulting and knowledge brokering. And I was recently involved in IDRC's Collaborative Adaptation Research Initiative in Africa and Asia and FCDO and UKRI's Future Climate for Africa programme. Both of which promoted equitable transdisciplinary partnerships. And I hope to reflect a little bit on those in the discussions.
Thank you very much, Catherine. So I'm going to start with the first question. So one of the goals highlighted during COP26 is to urgently adapt to protect communities and natural habitats. From your unique perspectives, what does this mean in practical terms for your sector? Susan, would you mind starting us off?
really happy to start on that one. It's a very important question. I mean, we're in the process of trying to enable researchers to effectively find solutions to problems. And I think the key phrase that's in the question that you posed there is that part about urgently adapting. So first of all, we need to be very sure what the future climate is going to look like and understand that over different timescales. So there's still a challenge for us as funders to support the generation of really, really good climate forecasting models so that people can take that information at a scale that's relevant to them and understand what the impact might be. I think the next thing that we have to think about is where are the gaps in knowledge? So are there some areas that we actually understand really well? And if not, is it important that we commission research into the areas that we don't understand really well? So somehow we have to ask the researchers to take the knowledge that they have and tell us what are the most important areas to be commissioning research in as well. I think we have a lot of data, but is that data available to people? So can the communities actually work out what they can learn from the data that's already been collected so that we can be very focused in the investments that we make because of that urgent timescale? And then I'm not going to expand much more because I think it might come up in other people's responses, and if it doesn't, I can come back to it. But one thing I think is really important is that we need to ask the research community to think on faster timescales. So people tend to have a habit of going to what's familiar, and it's very familiar to work on a 3 or 5 year timescale to look at a problem. Is that actually the correct timescale now, or do people need to be trying to undertake research that will give both a diagnosis and a solution in a much shorter timescale, so 1 year timescale or 18 months? Now, that's a big challenge, I think, for the research community because they tend to not ease themselves into a problem, but have 6 months to get stuff started, 2.5 years to do it, and then a bit of time at the end to sort of translate the knowledge. So I think there's a challenge to the research community about focusing on where are the big problems that we can make a difference on and how quickly we can do that. And then as a research funder, it's our job to try and support that through designing research calls that makes that happen. So I'll leave it there, Eliane, and pass over to someone else now.
So thank you very much. I'd like to pass it on to Catherine.
Thanks. Yeah, I very much agree with Susan that I think what the important messaging from COP26 was the urgency that was kind of recognized, because I think, many people have known for a long time that we need to be adapting to protect communities and natural habitats, and very many people have been working to do exactly that. But I think what COP26 brought to add to that was additional high-level attention, which hopefully will make the addressing of those challenges easier all around. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Eliane.
Thank you, Catherine. Lancelot?
Thank you, Eliane. And just to build on what Catherine just said, and also on what Susan was mentioning, I think that the protection of vulnerable communities and natural habitat is one of the major challenges that everyone agree on that. But on a practical side, sometimes we recognize that it is still things that need to be done to increase the way that we ensure that communities and natural habitat are complementaries. And in my opinion, as much as the ecological dimension is key to humankind solidarity and diversity, responding to the urgency of protecting communities while preserving biodiversity must require intervention in many domains, such as, for example, the adaptation capacities of local actors. I think someone mentioned local capacities, which needs to be built. And when I'm talking about local capacities, I don't only refer to technical capacities or technological transfer, but also to financial capacities. Because sometimes we do have the technology, but we do not have the funds necessary to make sure that we can upscale all the technologies that are developed. And the second point was that I want to mention on this first question is that We also need to focus on the implementation of adaptation measures that allow the preservation of the complementarity between humankind and nature. And to illustrate that, we can look for approaches such as climate smart agriculture, or also nature-based solutions that have proved to be the best way to promote ecological conservation and human well-being at the same time. And in a time of crisis like this one, we cannot work about humankind without taking into consideration the preservation of the nature. And maybe one last point in which is particularly important to me, and I think also I will build on what Susan mentioned, is the fact that it's particularly important also to make sure that the knowledge already available are accessible to everyone. During this pandemic, we kind of have been able to see that no matter how important is a research, if it is not very well communicated to the public, it will not be used. So it is really important to make sure that research is accessible to everyone, especially to the communities most affected by climate change. And I will stop that, Eliane. Thanks.
Mark, would you like to add?
Yes, thanks. So let me just start by agreeing with Lancelot very much that I think we've had a history of engaging with climate change very heavily driven by the climate science, which continues to be super important. But as the impacts of climate change are being observed more and more, I think we recognize, particularly, but not exclusively, in low and middle income countries, that climate risk, loss and damage is often driven by vulnerability, so by social processes of development that intersect with climate. But we do not need to have climate data and models to know that certain places are exposed. Although of course that changes, but I think we have to some extent we can act. And so that it's the social vulnerability and the lack of knowledge and data there that I think is rapidly becoming more aligned. So we have two areas of kind of urgency, if you like. There's a concern as well as sort of celebrating urgency and what we hoped out of COP would come a raised profile for adaptation. I don't think that really did come to the extent that people were hoping. Maybe that will come out of the Africa COP to come. But urgency in any case, whilst there's a welcome upsurge perhaps in funding, raises concerns about the capacity of agencies, whether they're research, but also policy that we might research on how they will make that spend. So historically, if there's an upsurge in funding, that funding tends to be spent on things that have been spent on before. So there's a lack of reflection and a lack of innovation that comes with an upsurge in funding. And also there tends sometimes to be normal rules put aside. So there are dangers that accountability, transparency might be lost, particularly for more marginal actors. So the extent to which local marginal actors, the urban poor, the rural poor, women, children, indigenous communities will be able to shape this upsurge in funding, that's a real question. So I think there's lots of space for research, particularly research applied through partnerships and that's co-produced, to get into this space before it exists, if you like. So to really start building relationships both with decision makers and local actors who may be marginalized from an upsurge in funding, so that if that comes, when it comes, researchers will be well positioned to provide some transparency, to provide viewpoints on how that funding could be dispersed, as well, of course, as the work of ensuring that we have very good adaptation options in front of us as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. You're actually helping me leading to the next question. The next questions are really around the term of equitable partnerships. And so this term is evolving in what it means. What more can be done to ensure local people and local knowledge contribute to climate change adaptation? Catherine, would you like to start us on this?
Yes, absolutely. This is an issue that that I think about a lot and I'm very committed to. And I think equitable partnerships, there's equity in all kinds of dimensions, but let me pick up on a few bits. I think, we have this current reality where we've both implicitly and explicitly prioritized the global north over the global south and scientific knowledge over non-scientific knowledge. But I think we're seeing increasing recognition now that there are many different knowledge systems, and we need to decolonize knowledge production, because this current emphasis on Western science is very exclusionary of local people and local knowledge in different contexts. And I think it's great to see increasing dialogue around these issues and increasing commitment to equitable partnership from all the different actors that need to be involved for this to come about. And just to give one example, the Adaptation Research Alliance was launched at COP26 to focus on results-oriented action research, and it's just launched a call for micro grants. I think it's one of the first calls that's been issued, and it shows that there needs to be co-creation of future adaptation priorities by partnerships that involve research institutions and knowledge brokers and users of information from the very start. And I think that's one example of where more central kind of user engagement is going to be key. And I hope this kind of partnership from the start will become more of the norm going forward, because I think it's really important for equitable partnerships to grow and for them to be effective for a wider range of people. Thanks.
Thank you. Lancelot, you were talking about the critical issue of communication. And so I think also how we frame what we're doing around this is very critical. So what do you see we need to do more of in terms of ensuring local people and local knowledge contribute to climate change adaptation?
Thank you very much, Eliane, for your question. And what I can say as a first point is that when we talk about equitable partnership and local knowledge, we need to consider that all voices and all knowledge must be taken into consideration. Local population in semi-arid areas in Senegal, Mali, etc., have not waited to share about adaptation before doing so. So it has always been part of their daily life. So they have experience, they learn a lot of lessons that must be taken into consideration when we are designing a research, an adaptation research. The second point is when we talk about equitable partnership, it's true that the term has a lot evolved in the time, but speaking about equitable partnership is key also when you have to take into consideration the position and the partnership of all stakeholders, including those at the grassroots level. We have to make sure that they are fully involved in both the design of the research and also the definition of adaptation policies, so that these policies can fully address their concern. And if I can give you an example, a few years ago, as part of a program Catherine knows very well, the CARIA program, Collaborative Adaptation Research in Africa and Asia, we kind of initiate a lot of pilot new way of doing research that put the focus on building research on the demand of the beneficiaries or the end users. It was really interesting to see how many research questions and gaps we have been able to kind of build on based on the voices of the people in the ground. And this is something to me that is really important. And the last point I want to share before giving the floor to another person is that when we talk about also equitable partnership, we must not only consider the equity in that partnership, but we must also consider that the research needs to be inclusive and just for those who will do that. And when I'm referring to justice, I'm also referring to justice in terms of intellectual production. We have to make sure that research from the global south are also part in the production of articles, for example. And to me, this is also really important. Thank you.
Very much, Lancelot. Mark, would you like to add to this?
Perhaps, briefly, to definitely agree with the preceding speakers, and I perhaps to to highlight the difficulty and the challenges of doing what's so elegantly been described. So working with local actors in a truly co-productive sense that acknowledges that science is just one kind of very formalized knowledge, and that there are many other experiential is great, but how one not just surfaces those different knowledges, but places them next to each other and begins to have a conversation about which to prioritize or how to hybridize those knowledges, particularly if you're working with marginalized actors who have limited time to do anything other than maintain a livelihood, and for whom the consequences of those decisions might be quite profound. So stepping away from the sort of science model to a co-produced one is really essential, but it has to be done really responsibly. And the second point I'd say, reflecting on my own practice, is also how challenging that sort of an equitable partnership can be within a research team, particularly one that straddles geographies and disciplines. And there's a danger that with equity can come an inadvertent shifting of the burden or of decision making onto more junior staff, for example, or staff who just feel uncomfortable in a particular context. So that, for me, one of the lessons of working in an equitable space is to constantly be challenging the notion of leadership. And I'll leave it there. I think that these things for me are real everyday challenges, and it is like many things in research. Success rests on really the best communication that you can have with all partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. You're making me think about the notion that sometimes leadership is followership, and how do we have that balance between nudging younger researchers to own space and also creating the needed support for people not to feel burdened. So those are really important points. So the next question I want to go to is, what research is needed to respond to the adaptation gap? So I'm going to start with you, Susan.
Thanks, Eliane. It will vary depending on the location in the world, actually, where we're carrying out the research. And from some analysis that's been done with the researchers that are working with NERC anyway, we're looking at kind of a wide range of activity which are both really to do with sustainability and hazards and understanding what they might be. So whether we're looking at coastal hazards, ocean resilience, energy security, or whether we're actually looking at aspects such as social justice and ethics that play into that. And I'm not a social scientist, so I will leave that to others to expand on that point. But one of the areas that straddles all parts of the world, I think, that would be needing to mitigate and adapt to climate change is effectively looking at agricultural practices, and I would say water as well. I don't think we pay enough attention to water. I think we focus very strongly on increasing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and temperatures, but so much of that is actually also influenced by the water cycle. And I think that the water cycle, the hydrological cycle, will become more important. Our agriculture is deeply affected by the hydrological cycle, soil moisture, groundwater availability for irrigation. So agriculture kind of cuts across. Actually, things like ecosystem restoration, not losing sight. I mean, these are areas that have been around for a while, and it bothers me about why we're not solving the problems, but understanding actually still what the natural capital in the world does to actually mitigate and adapt to a changing climate. Not thinking about that deeply enough. I mean, you can get into a lot of detail around things like weather forecasting, as I talked about earlier on, to get some very sort of detailed analysis. But I kind of struggle with one part of this, which is that the solutions can and need to be very local, but I'm not sure that we have the resource to always come up with a local solution. So how do the research community take something that is the knowledge that they gain about a particular area and then make that transferable? I think that's a really important challenge in that adaptation gap. So, you know, we invest in another project, someone does a lot of detailed field work in a particular country under a particular set of conditions that they think will capture a future climate or a hazard environment. How do we translate that? And I would like to see that actually, in some ways, investment has two purposes. It's to give a solution that can be local, and that local scale can still be quite big, but it also has reach that can be global as well, so that everyone can learn from it. So I'll pass back to the others now, Eliane, to add to that.
I just wanted to say to the attendees, please keep populating the discussion for questions. We'll get to them later, so we really welcome your questions. So please continue to share any questions you have. So on this particular question of what research is needed to respond to the adaptation gap, I'd like to go on to Catherine, if that's okay.
Yep, thanks, Eliane. Again, quite a few different entry points to this question. I mean, I think on the one hand, there's been a really great range of papers published this year that have highlighted gaps in adaptation research. The big data approach by the Global Adaptation Mapping Initiative, I think they've done some really great papers highlighting geographical gaps and sectoral gaps in adaptation research. But I guess this is also going back to what Lancelot said in response to the previous question. This is also a case of how, I mean, I can give my perspective on what the research gaps are, but of course that perspective is going to be very different from anyone else's. And I think the key here as well is to make sure that we cast that the net as wide as we can in asking this question. But also, I mean, whilst of course we need research to respond to adaptation gap, I also think that we need better brokering of existing knowledge that's been generated by research, because it's not always used to inform policy and practice. And give one example, in a country where I work, there are significant policy commitments to expanding irrigation. Also agreeing with you, Susan, that water is an important issue here that's maybe not looked at too much. But in this particular country, there is plenty of information available that projects future water availability and highlights that these policy commitments to irrigation are not going to be sustainable, and could well set the country on a path to maladaptation. So, you know, the challenge here is not that the research hasn't been done, but it's not reflected in the policy. And, you know, that could be for any number of reasons. It could be a simple issue of communication, that the policymakers are not aware of that research, or it could be that we need better research into understanding decision-making context and the political economy of how decisions are made, because maybe that knowledge is known, but it's not being used because other powerful forces are at play that suggest that irrigation should be followed. So I think whilst there are still gaps and that the perspective on those gaps will be very variable, I also think at the same time we need to have a commitment to ensuring that research is better communicated and used, which may require more social science research to understand how that should take place. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I think both you and Susan have made really critical points around water. And Susan, I just want to say, you talked about mitigation, which is a word that hadn't been mentioned before. And I think that the critical importance of really expanding of what it is we're looking at the gap, and this idea of linking research to decision-making and how we can influence decision-making is so important, Catherine. So thank you for sharing that. Mark, would you like to add anything else in terms of what research is needed to respond to the adaptation gap?
Thank you. Yeah. So if the adaptation gap is the gap between adaptation actions that are realized to reduce risk and either current risk or future risk, then, you know, the first thing to say based on the evidence is that the adaptation gap is everywhere, in every world region, in every sector, and that it is deepest for the poor or marginalized, which takes us straight away to the question, why? If the same technology, financial resources, environmental knowledges, and so on, broadly speaking, are available to the richer and the poorer in particular countries, interested in particular sectors, why is it that universally it is the poorer and the more marginalized that report a larger adaptation gap? And so, to me, that then takes us to a whole whole range of science methodologies, actually a number of which are, I think, already practiced, well, definitely already practiced, but it just underlines their importance. So just for example, I think the importance of working both with local actors that we've highlighted a lot today and strategic policy actors, perhaps in the same project, so that science can be something of a common language or a convening space to help raise the profile of those things that influence the survival chances and well-being of the poor. And to elevate that is one option. It's a soft way of approaching structural political economy change without going, head on. Although that's another option. And the second way of approaching this is, I think, through interdisciplinarity. And again, just from my own experience as a researcher, I find that the sort of natural social sciences, I imagine medical as well, have a lot of purchase with decision makers and allow one to get legitimacy and a foot in the door that you can follow up with the sort of softer sciences, if you like, and start talking about then equitable voice, partnership in decision making, and so forth. So the role of interdisciplinarity, not just to get a fuller picture of the nature of the challenge or the research outcome, but actually to enable processes of change, and as perhaps part of that solution of scaling up. And just one final comment on climate change, just to highlight the moving nature of climate change risk. So the adaptation gap is constantly shifting, and it's shifting because, for example, I think we're recognizing, and this was reflected in COP, the importance of supply chains as new mechanisms through which risk and vulnerability move. Also cascading risks, the way in which climate hazards interact with one another and with non-climate hazards. Dynamic vulnerability, that people's qualities, their assets and so on change over time. So we can't just have a one-off measurement of the vulnerability status of a livelihood group and expect that to stay the same for a period of time. They'll constantly change in response to shocks and so forth. And then, of course, finally, the way in which climate change intersects with other systemic shocks, and COVID is a great example there. So I think we have to constantly be praising what the adaptation gap is, and there's that last list to me is a huge area of of new opportunity for research, for applied research. Thank you
very much, Mark. So Lancelot, would like to add around this idea of research, what research is needed to respond to the adaptation gap?
Thank you very much, Eliane. And I'm not sure that I can say a lot after what the other panelists just mentioned. Maybe this is why I'm not going to focus on what type of gaps need to be filled, but more on how we have to do research or to organize research. And to identify gaps in adaptation, I think those at the grassroots are certainly best placed to help us answer that question, to help us identify what are the gaps, what are the main questions, what are the main challenges they are facing on a daily basis, and what they need or where they need to have solutions. That is why it is really important to make sure that when we are designing a research project, we must ensure that co-production is at the core of that initiative, and co-production not only by associating the beneficiaries in the design of the research, but also by involving them in the definition of political solutions that will be put in place. And this is particularly important in Africa, for example, where, at all levels, should it be at the level of regions or national level, sometimes it is really difficult to make sure that research findings are integrated into local development plans. And we have many examples of research findings that haven't been able to produce a lot of results because they were a very lack of appropriation or ownership by people on the ground. And to me, doing research differently means that we are able to involve local communities in the entire process of the designing the research, but also in giving them responsibilities in the research uptake. This is something that I want to share also with the other panelists. Thank you.
Very much, Lancelot. This really takes me to my follow-up question around how can we evaluate adaptation feasibility and outcomes for sustainable development? Would anybody like to engage with this question?
I'm happy to have one quick statement on it, which is, I mean, it's a big gap for research and for practitioners, and it's a place where research has an awful lot to contribute to. No, not just, well, to start off with, reviewing the other kind of evaluation methodologies that have been around for a long time, around sort of industrial risk management, or around evaluating social ecological risks that come from development projects and so forth. So there's a lot of experience or frameworks out there that can be explored. For me, the key dynamic, though, is how far we want to evaluate adaptation actions against their stated aims, which very often are to reduce risk to a very specific target. So it may be to reduce risk to a 1 in 500 year flood event for a certain number of people living in a particular place. Now, that's an excellent aim to have. So that's perfectly fine. But of course, any adaptation action takes place in a social and ecological, a wider social and ecological context. Any adaptation act is an act of public policy or local engagement. So you could say it has a responsibility to be evaluated against actually a wider set of criteria. And I think there's a good debate in the literature at the moment that is encouraging adaptation evaluation, although it's at a junior stage, if you like, to move beyond a kind of financial cost-benefit analysis approach towards something closer to what I see in the literature as being called climate resilient development, which asks, has an adaptation action contributed also to mitigation, to social justice, to ecological sustainability, to the transformative potential of wider society, and so on. So those are quite big items that might be rather difficult to evaluate against, but that's the specific point of discussion, I think, that we're at in evaluation. Yes, there's the technical piece that we can learn from many others that I mentioned at the beginning, but then there's this particular kind of philosophical part that adaptation, because it really is public policy and it's future oriented, has a responsibility to engage with. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. You really point to the need for both the technical and adaptive leadership in terms of how we move forward and allowing emergence of expanding how we look at things. So would anybody also like to add in terms of this idea of how can we evaluate adaptation feasibility and outcomes for sustainable development?
If I can just add to what Mark has said, I think he's highlighted nicely something we need to be very careful of, which is the fact that the reality is we're often working through projects, and projects tend to encourage us to focus on a particular geographical location or a particular group of people. And I would agree that the way evaluation is currently set up is more focused on process and single loop learning. Did we do well what we said we were going to do, with less focus on the double and triple loop learning about, well, what are the consequences of that more broadly in terms of spatially and socially, but also were we doing the right thing in the first place when we look beyond just where our spotlight is focused. So I mean, I don't necessarily have a solution to that, but I think the commitment of funders as well to think more programmatically is very promising here. I mean, that was the approach that we took within both CARIA and Future Climate for Africa. And the newly announced Climate and Resilience Programme, I believe, is going to follow a similar model. And I think having that kind of programmatic bird's eye view will help us to take a bigger picture perspective on some of these issues, and hopefully avoid falling into the traps of projects where some of these things fall through the cracks. And I think looking at the effectiveness and the equity of adaptation, as opposed to just the efficiency, is one of the big opportunities of that. Thanks, Eliane.
Thank you. Susan, I saw your hand up. Would you like to add to it as well?
Thanks, Eliane, and the previous speakers. Actually, it's really thought-provoking. I mean, Mark talked about potential mitigation. You could also think about evaluating it in terms of, can you design in co-benefits as well? So an example might be where you're thinking about healthcare facilities with very poor sanitation, and you're trying to understand, I'll go back to the hydrological cycle and climate change. Is there an opportunity there, for example, to address issues of sanitation as well as sustainable development at the same time? The adaptation is evaluating it in terms of its feasibility and outcomes. If we could go to the outcomes, then there's the really key part around communication. Who do we communicate this to, and who ultimately is going to be making decisions? And it's probably going to be at a governmental level, policymaker level, as to whether that adaptation would continue to be supported. Would it be rolled out further? Could it be scaled up? So that communication is absolutely crucial, but also maybe leading up to that, we have to do a bit about communicating that things have to fail sometimes before we find the right answer. I mean, maybe going back to your first question, Eliane, we don't have that much time to fail, but we can't progress without failing sometimes as well. So then there's a degree of risk. You know, is something worth trying in a risky manner, because the outcome, if it succeeded, could be so great that it would overcome the risk of failure? How do we judge that? And I think that that's probably a socio-economic model that somehow has to tie in with, if we're still talking about sustainable development, the sort of natural environmental part of it as well. The other thing I'm wondering about, though, is that where is there a role in technology in the future? You know, can we actually imagine some of these outcomes in advance of actually doing them? How fast will the technology move? And is that technology accessible to everybody that needs to be involved? That's a really big question, first of all. But I was thinking, for example, like digital twinning, as you were talking, you know, could we actually create that environment, implement the adaptation, understand that we've got the interests and knowledge correct that need to inform that implementation, and then run it and see. You know, if we think back now about what we know from Earth observation technology, and that's not that old really in terms of how long we've been dealing with kind of climate change. That's come on leaps and bounds. So I'm not saying that technology is the answer. I'm just wondering if technology actually also comes into the mix to allow us to project what might happen, so that we can decide about risk and fail. I'll leave it there, Eliane. Thanks.
And Susan, you really come to a really critical point that I think a lot about, in terms of how do we fail forward collectively, and you know, how do we get those lessons learned, allowing the whole collective intelligence to learn together, because we need to advance quicker, but that also means we also need to share our failures, so we don't get a repetition of these failures. So I think that is really critical. And so I just wanted to check in with Lancelot. Would you like to add something to this question before I go to the next question?
Yes, but very quick comment on the fact that in addition to the importance to consider the time when we are talking about adaptation solutions, we also have to consider that sometimes adaptation, the fact of integrating an adaptation solution into a political plan is a political decision. And we have to sometimes face barriers that are really related to the political dimension of any decision we are taking. You can develop a research project that has a lot of very practical outcomes, but when it comes to the time of upscaling that research solution, you will have to face barriers, political barriers actually. And you know, when we are designing research, funders need to also take that dimension into consideration. How are we also building the capacities of decision makers to make sure that they understand very well climate change issues, they understand the solution we are proposing, and they're also willing to adapt this solution at a larger scale. And to me, this is something that is really, really important. Also, in addition to the fact that we have to take into consideration the very wide diversity of climate and socioeconomic conditions, as well as the adaptation strategies that are made into practice. You know, simply evaluating adaptation feasibility by identifying indicators will not be a solution, because what works in a place may not be the same in another place. So we have to take into consideration the specificity of each context, and rather work with guiding principle, for example, considering what can we consider as effective adaptation, and how are we building on that to make sure that the solutions that are proposed are kind of helping the population to increase the well-being. So this is something I wanted to add to the group discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lancelot. Those are really critical points in terms of the need for localization and the universality of principles that we can really have globally, and how we hold both those tensions. So actually, that's a really great opening to my following question in terms of how can research funders, universities, and data managers best champion inclusive, urgent, and solutions-oriented adaptation research? So Mark, I'm going to start with you.
I'll just say something briefly about universities, I think, and the kind of local, if you like, knowledge ecology, if one can call it that. So the relationship between university as researchers, as teachers, as students, as holders of knowledge, and as partners in creating knowledge, sort of bridges between local populations, future and present policy actors, and bridges into international debates as well. And this might not be universal, but I often find that in the midst of fast turnover amongst the policy and political communities, it's really universities and perhaps I was going to say maybe think tanks and research centers, but I think universities are even more stable than think tanks and research centers and sort of NGOs. They are the point of sustainability. And there's a real challenge, I think, for governments, both low middle income countries and richer countries, to think about resourcing universities. And this is not just researchers and students, studentships, but also administrative staff, to have the capacity to be excellent as well as sustainable. It's almost reversing the challenge that we normally have, no? That we seek for sustainability in difficult places. I think universities have proven that they can be sustainable, but can they be excellent and sustainable? So it's I think that's all I want to say on this point, that we miss a trick, I think, if we don't really include universities in all of their guises and their alumni and so forth as part of the knowledge ecology of particular places, and encourage support of all kinds for them, and of course relationships between to flourish. Thanks.
Mark, I really like this idea of knowledge ecology and how do we make it as inclusive as possible. Susan, what are your points of view around this idea of how can research funders, universities, and data managers best champion inclusive, urgent, and solutions-oriented adaptation research?
Yeah. So I could describe this in two main themes. One is our external activity, and the other one is our internal activity within the Research Council. So if we take the external activity first of all, I think we need really equitable partnerships with the people who have the best opportunities to help solve the problem. And those equitable partnerships are around creating space for people to talk, to identify what a solution or research need may look like before a research funding call becomes available, so that you're offering some sort of equality of opportunity there for the best people to get involved. that means that we need to probably put some funding into these thinking spaces rather than sort of investing very directly into the research problem solving space. So, and we have to have our eyes to the clock when we're thinking about this, because we did start with talking about urgent needs here. We need to also work, though, with trying to use our influence to have other research funders in partner countries involved with us where possible. And where that's not possible, is respectful for us to kind of try and lead that, to gather interest round about it. I mentioned the high-risk solutions earlier on, and I think we have to have a space, we have to convince our peer review panels to allow there to be a space for high-risk solutions as well, because sometimes reviewers find it difficult to understand when something is not fully formed, that it could be really exciting and could be game-changing. I think when it comes back to the kind of areas to invest in, we really need to be also horizon scanning. It's a bit of a predictable term, but it's true. You know, we've got to know what's really important to invest in. And we actually rely on interactions with, for example, the knowledge ecologists that Mark just talked about, and the NGOs and people on the ground who are experiencing the effects of climate change to tell us things that we don't know, so that we can try and think about how that would work as an investment opportunity. So they're the kind of external activities that I see where we have to go out and find people and make change with those people. I think the internal activities are that effectively who funds us. You know, we're funded by a government, and that government wants to see that there is a good outcome of the investment that they're making into research activity. And we also have to tension what we can invest funding in, because unfortunately, I don't think any research council has a pot that allows every problem to be invested in. So we have to be reporting effectively back to those who fund us that shows us the value of that investment. And in some way, that's then about harnessing the impact that comes out of that investment. And even if we go back to the space to fail as well, if you fail and reflect, you can still learn from that place. So, you know, being able to show how much further on an investment has moved a situation is really important. And we work quite hard at that within research councils. And I know that those that generate the understanding do as well. But we have to translate it up in a language that is understandable to the effectively, ultimately, the policymakers. So I think that's trying to give you a picture of both the fact that we want to reach out and partner, but we also need to reach up and to those that fund us and try and make convincing cases. And the two actually go hand in hand. Without the really good case studies of what a difference that research funding can make, we can't convince people that give us the funding either. And that's a really hard job.
Thank you, Susan, too, for pointing out these tensions. Catherine, would you like to add to this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, maybe I should say first, I'm not from a research funder or a university or a data manager, so I might have a slightly different perspective. Of course, I do work with all of those different categories, and I have had the opportunity to kind of look at program design and the partnerships which are set up to enable the solution-oriented adaptation research to take place. And I think following on from what Susan said about the equitable partnerships, I think that is really key to enable this to take place. And for those equitable partnerships, we need to recognize that there are very different starting points and realities, and that needs to be taken into account. And we need to kind of be aware of biases that we might have in funding systems that can create exclusions for organizations outside of the North, I think. I mean, there are often cases where research funders, for example, will prioritize Northern research or require a Northern lead, or there'll be perhaps a criteria that only a small portion of the overall funding can go to developing country partners. And often the way that funding, the modality of delivering that funding is often that it goes to one lead organization and they then distribute it. And I can completely see why that is. Of course, it reduces an admin burden, but that immediately sets up a hierarchy within the partnerships which can sometimes then filter through in terms of their activities. And I know if we look at evaluations of some recent programs which didn't do that, where they kind of bucked that trend, and if there was a consortium in place, each consortium member got money directly from the funder. There was very positive feedback that did a lot to create a sense of an equitable partnership within a consortium and kind of dismantle this hierarchy that might otherwise be in place. And that's, I mean, there I'm mainly talking about kind of research-based partnerships, but if we're to bring in other parties as well, which is necessary in transdisciplinary partnerships, and we recognize that transdisciplinary partnerships are necessary to effectively promote adaptation, then we're bringing in a wider range of organizations which have different norms, different operational procedures. And again, they might not necessarily fit with the dominant models that we've used in the past, that research funders have used and that universities have used. So I think we all need to cast the blinkers off a little bit and kind of be aware of where there are some blind spots in old systems that need to be adapted to kind of suit the new reality. And then I think, again, kind of following Susan's idea of external and internal, within those equitable partnerships, I think everyone who participates in that also needs to be aware of the need to kind of identify and trying to address some of their own biases, be willing to see the world differently, put themselves in someone else's shoes. And I guess having the space to do that and setting up projects to do that, and the idea of having kind of thinking space to decide how to design calls, that kind of thing. I think all of that is really important to shift the landscape, to create the opportunities where innovation can take place. Thanks.
Much, Catherine. Lancelot, would you like to add to this question?
Yes, and very briefly, and I will build on what Catherine just mentioned about biases. And I think one of the best way to deal with these biases is to work with consortia. And I'm going to take again example of the Carrier program, which put in place 5 consortia in Africa and Asia. And it was particularly important to work with this type of approach because we have been able to put together organizations from Africa and Asia working on the same thematic. And it was particularly interesting to see how we can compare the implementation of some solution in Africa and Asia, and how people in these 2 different locations were able to understand what type of key messages were coming out of this type of project. So working in consortia also is really important because, you know, climate change doesn't recognize the limit of boundaries. So working with consortia is the best way also to make sure that we are able to adopt a trans-boundary approach when we are dealing with climate change issues. So this is really, really, really important. And another dimension, and this is because I'm also a communication guy, that funders also need to invest a bit more in communication technology brokering, because, you know, we have a lot of knowledge already available, but a very, very minimum access of this knowledge by people who need it the most. So we need to invest a lot in the way we are communicating research, in the way we are making sure that we ensure research uptake. And this is something that is really critical to me. Thank you.
Very much, Lancelot. So we have a couple of questions that have come up that I'd like to bring to the panel's attention. So Amel Ahmad has asked that, you know, she understands the need to include other knowledge systems beyond Western scientific systems, and that Western science has certainly been exclusionary and a means of extending power structures and inequalities. But if we are to expand our way of looking at problems, is there not a step missing? If we are to include non-scientific systems in our considerations, and I think here she means non-scientific, that is non-Western scientific, don't we need to assess their scientific validity as well? For example, not all traditional medicines are effective, though some certainly are. Don't we need to assess their effectiveness scientifically before accepting them? Anybody want to tackle this challenging question?
I'm happy to jump in on that one. I think there's two issues there. There's the knowledge system, and then there's a solution that might be created out of a knowledge system. And I think the problem at the moment is that we sometimes overlook the whole knowledge system, and therefore we don't even get to have the dialogue that is necessary. And I know this is really difficult. As Mark said, it's much easier to say we need to bring these knowledge systems together than to actually do it. But yeah, I mean, how we evaluate the outcomes of knowledge systems, perhaps that needs to be recreated as well. It's, you know, we can't necessarily just evaluate out of one knowledge system if we're trying to bring knowledge systems together. So I think there's an awful lot of further investigation needs to take place here. Thanks.
Thank you, Catherine.
I can come in on that as well if you want. Really hard question. Thank you, whoever put it in. I've wondered that myself when I've gone on field work, and I guess that ways that we can actually already interpret whether these systems are effective in how we have our discussions. You know, that if people are trying to explain what is an outcome they believe of a particular way of doing things, then by having a collaborative discussion, you can kind of probe different areas. So it's what degree of assessment is actually needed. There's probably actually quite a lot of knowledge in the way we do things that the conversation will do that assessment. If it came down to a kind of either or, you know, and it was a real high risk approach, then maybe you would want a scientific assessment. But if there are other benefits, would you also assess the scientific way, looking at those benefits, you know, coming back to that sort of equality again? So a hard question, and one which actually we probably have to tackle more in the future when there is more of that type of interaction.
If maybe I could just add one little bit to that, because it is fascinating, and I think I work more in an urban context around adaptation risk management, and there it might be things like religious beliefs or gendered relationships that are deeply acculturated, but from an outside perspective appear deeply unequal as well. For generating with local partners different kinds of knowledge. Of course, there's a really powerful ethical question about what the implications are if you start to disturb somebody's, you know, the context of someone's religious belief or their relationships with others, and then leave. That's a problem. And I think we've learned through the sort of gender and development work that really successful change takes place through committed partnerships, probably over quite a period of time. And if we just go in, suggest an alternative view of the world, men and women are equal, and leave, that can actually make things a lot worse. So I don't think we've yet really had that conversation properly, certainly not in the urban space. I guess it may have been to some extent had around indigenous forecasting and climate services, the way in which different ways of perceiving the environment can dovetail with science and climate forecasting, and how one can use indigenous knowledge to perhaps promote or better communicate some of the Western science. But I think in this on those deeper questions of sort of belief and identity, I haven't seen much work in the climate space on that.
Lancelot, would you like to add to this?
Yes, and maybe just a quick reaction, because I really love that question actually, because it makes me also consider that we are referring here non-scientific kind of system in opposition to maybe traditional ones. And to me, this is probably where we are making the first mistake, because we don't have to oppose these two systems. It's not because knowledge doesn't have maybe a scientific dimension that is not valuable or acceptable. Of course, we need to make sure that we go through a kind of assessment process to make sure that this knowledge that, for example, belongs to local people have concrete advantages for people who are using that, but that doesn't mean that it's not valuable. So first of all, we have to shift the way of thinking, of considering local knowledge versus scientific knowledge, because I'm reading here the question, as well as we have indigenous knowledge that are not all effective, we also have scientific knowledge that are not all effective. So both cases are existing. We just simply need to make sure that, yes, we go through a process of assessment to make sure that the knowledge we want to consider has real impact and real positive impact, not negative impact, and also how we can ensure that we are able to upscale this type of knowledge. And to me, this is a way of kind of building a bridge between local knowledge and more Western scientific way of thinking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lancelot. This takes me back to a remark that Mark was talking about earlier in terms of the upsurge of an investment. And I just wanted to ask, why does upsurge in investment mean it is spent on what has been done before? What is failing here, and how can we change that?
Is that a question to me?
Yes.
Or everyone as well?
Everyone as well. Let's start us out.
Yeah, sure. I guess it's a general comment that suggests that if there's a rapid need to disperse funds, and it'd be interesting if this is different amongst research funders. I'm thinking more about policy funders, that there tends to be a lot of risk aversion, and so that money will be spent through, pathways, budget lines, through ministries, through trusted community-based organizations that have already done good enough things, that are close enough to an agenda to allow that money to be spent. It's an agenda of spending money as much as it is about affecting positive change, or at least that's the danger, of an upsurge if it happens very quickly without preparing in all the sorts of ways we've said. I mean, it would be wonderful if we can think through ways in which all of the kind of co-productive, respectful ways of working across different cultures can prefigure an upsurge in funding, so that there's if you like, a kind of landscape of opportunities that funding can land in. I mean, that's really what we want. And arguably in climate change adaptation, we have some opportunity to do that. Whereas it could be, you could argue that mitigation, is a stage ahead in terms of urgency, and we can debate that. So there's an opportunity. I think it's as I say, to answer the question directly, it's this sense that I think it was Catherine who said, or asked us to really prioritize reflection within research teams and the sorts of relationship building. And if you have a rapid disbursement of funds, that's difficult for funders to enter into. So the calls might not be as reflexive, and they will reach out to the people that they've worked with before, who understandably will have a sort of a collective way of thinking about the world. Thanks.
Just to add to that, Mark, one of the things as a researcher I've realized is I've had to dream what I wanted funding for and wait for opportunities to meet the dream. And so I think part of it also is in this emergent space. We have to allow ourselves to start working on the proposals that there is not yet funding for, so that when they show up, we're ready. And I really feel that as a researcher, if you don't practice that, you're never going to meet the game where it is. So any other comments on this before I move to the next question?
Mark gave a really interesting perspective there. I was particularly intrigued in hearing why he made that comment. And I agree with you, Mark, actually. I don't think that there's not a desire to do the best activity with the money possible, but it's actually constrained by financial models of having to be spent in time, sometimes which are government. But the other, I mean, you know, a particular perspective was very strong. One of the other things I was thinking is that I want to understand what's already been an inequality in what literature is actually paid attention to. And Catherine picked, you know, the in the common and can be worry sometimes has been looked properly at a range of journals internationally. You would see that someone has thought about this before, but because it's not coming through in your Twitter feed, or it's not coming through in your journal notification, or it's something that doesn't have an impact factor, then it doesn't get paid attention to. So I think there's two parts of it. One is the constraints on having to spend the money quickly, but the other one is not looking deep enough into what's already been done to see if we fully understand it.
That's an excellent point, Susan. Especially, one of the things I noticed in my own work is that there is a bias against mitigation research that is happening in Africa. It's very hard to find, and you actually cannot use the word mitigation if you're looking for it. You need to look at regenerative agriculture, other words, but you actually will find very little if you say mitigation in Africa. And so how algorithms are working to highlight certain initiatives versus others is a really critical one that we don't realize is part of our blind spots. And Lancelot also earlier was talking about our blind spots and you know, others were as well. And the importance of how do we take those blinders off so we include more as we move forward. So maybe I'm just going to go to the next question by Sunny Rathod. That's, given international partnerships are key to addressing global challenges like climate change, does the panel think there's an increased risk of national approaches due to things like geopolitics?
Yes, I do think there is. And we've got to really hard to overcome that. I think that the research councils are really good at talking to one another, and the geopolitics don't get in the way. But in terms of actually then funding from the government, it can be very hard. So, I mean, you know, at the moment, I don't know if you're following UK politics at all, but one of our ministers has been disinvited to a discussion about migrants trying to come to UK shores. 31 people drowned very, very sadly yesterday. The geopolitics are getting in the way, and how far down they'll come to research funders, we can't tell. So that's probably coming back to us about communicating the need really clearly and the impact that the funding can have. And actually climate change is a global issue. You know, it will affect us all, and mitigation anywhere in the world will help. So, you know, trying to get that back, that we will be impacted as well, that we shouldn't let the geopolitics get in the way, because this isn't just a hard outcome that's going to be limited to particular parts of the globe. But I think the geopolitics are very complex.
I think there's maybe a point here around the world that science creates and how different that is perhaps to the world that we live in. So science or researchers, and again, reflecting on my own work, so not meant as any critique of others, will often go to the easiest point of access, which tends to be the community, or it tends to be like-minded public sector actors. So we know, at least in the literature, again, that I'm familiar with, so I might be wrong, we know relatively little in climate change adaptation compared to community actors of the performance of the private sector, which very often sets the constraints for community action, for livelihoods, for access to all sorts of services. And similarly, we know relatively little about the behavior of non-Western donors who are often actually shaping critical infrastructure provision, budget, legal practices at national level. So perhaps for those two reasons, the importance of the private sector and non-Western donors, which might not have been as large, 20, 30 years ago, the space that science can access is not the whole picture. And in the same way that, geopolitics is an overarching concern, I think it filters down to those sorts of concerns about the way in which we imagine development, climate risk, adaptation opportunities through a lens of science, which can only access a proportion of the decision-making space. I guess what do we do about that? At least that's difficult, but at least the first point, and it's out there in the critical political economy literature, would be to recognize the gaps and to sort of map that out. It's not something I've seen in the literature. Thanks.
Scott, would you like to add to this question?
Yeah, very briefly, because to me it's really, really important question and difficult question, because to say that geopolitics is the problem and at the same time the solutions, because we still need to translate the international policies into national practices, actually. So we cannot do the one without considering the other one. We cannot define international policies without making sure that they have some concrete adaptation at national level. So it reminds me what I said previously during one of the questions you asked, Eliane, about the importance also of considering the political dimension when we are talking about climate change, because it's really key. Decision makers are the one who can increase the speed of the implementation of climate solutions. But at the same time, once the problem is entering the political dimension, we can see a lot of barriers happening. So to me, it's really critical at that place, because we have the problem and the solution at the same time. And perhaps this is where we can have a gap in terms of research, or making sure that decision makers understand very well the urgent need to take into consideration climate change issues and solutions in national development plan. And in Africa, we have a lot of very good examples. And I'm for example, speaking about Senegal as part of the program CARIA, we have been able to help national development plan to integrate gender and climate resilience in national development plan. And we have been able to do that by engaging with them from the beginning of the design of the research. And to me, involving decision makers at the very early stage of the design of research is what can help any project to make sure that politicians are aware of the research and can consider that in their political plans. Thanks, Eliane.
Very much, Lancelot. So we have a great question, I feel, in terms as we reach the wrapping up stage of this. So Kristen Corbett asks, what inspires you, giving you hope that we can connect as a global research and policy community through equitable research to address climate change in a more sustainable and inclusive way? Would anybody like to start on this one?
I'm happy to jump in on that. On a positive note, I mean, I think the fact that we're discussing this at this conference and the fact that there are so many of you participating here is what gives us hope, because there's a lot of people who are very committed to doing just this. And, that may only be the first step, but it is at least a step in the right direction. And I think we're definitely seeing a kind of momentum shift towards this. And some of the discussions at COP26 officially and perhaps more unofficially also showed a lot of commitment here. So I would say, I am quite inspired and I am quite positive, because I think we're a growing mass and we've got a lot of learning to do, but with commitment, I'm sure we'll be able to do it. Thanks.
Thank you.
I guess I'm old enough to have a kind of sense of a career arc, and if you like, that inspires me now. It sort of validates and means that what one's doing is maybe useful. So I see particularly master students now in all sorts of positions of real power, from international organizations through to national and research institutions. And so to have had an opportunity to inform their learning, and they've gone through a program which is very much about the politics of adaptation. That's exciting. You see, there's lots of influence, and similarly around ideas, so that if one sees ideas that one's engaged with actually then being taken up by the policy community and by others who translate those ideas into really meaningful actions, that's super inspiring and humbling as well. So we're often kind of berate ourselves, I think, the academic community, and particularly perhaps on the theoretical side as well, as being more difficult to track in terms of impact. But one can really see that theory, as well as the empirical work we've been really paying close attention to, can affect change. So I find that validates, if you like, an orientation to knowledge creation that I'm committed to doing more of. Thank you.
So Susan and Lancelot, would you like to add to this?
You need to repeat the question, because I dropped it. I didn't hear it, I'm afraid. So if you don't mind.
Yes, absolutely. So the question is, what inspires you, giving you hope that we can connect as a global research and policy community to equitable partnerships to address climate change in a more sustainable and inclusive way?
Okay. Would you like to go first, Lancelot, or?
Yes, briefly, and because I think we are referring here to hope. What is giving us hope, and what is giving me hope is the fact that we have more and more young people engaged in that, and the fact that we have more and more young people engaged in that means that the next generation is already aware of that and is willing to engage a lot, to challenge decision makers in the way we are engaging all together to tackle climate change challenges. And a concrete example of that was the international mobilization about climate justice. This was something really amazing to see all these people around the world raising their voice to demand to decision makers to do more for climate adaptation. And this is something that is really important, not only because we have the research community that is capable to produce evidence that will guide decision-making processes, but also we have the human community that is willing to uptake that research to make sure that any decision is having real impact in people's lives. So to me, the fact of having young people engage more and more about that, to be more and more aware of what is happening, is something that is giving me a lot of hope in the future. Thank you.
So I think that Lancelot put it really well about the young people. And I've been in this job for 2 years now. And one of the reasons I wanted to move into the job is that I think this is a pivotal period in human history where we will be trying to make a change around climate change and therefore adaptation. And I think it is driven actually by the fact that there's a different generation of people care, and they will be coming through as important influencers in the future and are having an influence just now. But I'm generally quite an optimistic person. So the type of things that I see that also make a difference are actually technology. So, we're connecting across continents, and that should allow people in the future. I know there's still technological problems, but we should be able to do research in a way that is more equitable, because we can have partners and we can plan things better before we start. We can also do it in a more sustainable manner. Why do we actually have to travel? I mean, that is a bit of the elephant in the room around about climate change. So, can't we plan things without traveling is something I'm really interested in. But I know that COP26 didn't have the outcome that was hoped for, but I looked at it and I was still really impressed that despite the geopolitics, or maybe in spite of the geopolitics, people are willing to get together periodically and try and solve a problem. And net zero is pretty high up most governments' agenda. You know, it has, despite the, I know it very well from the UK perspective, so despite the pressures that there are on our services associated with the pandemic, the government still hasn't dropped net zero. And I return to an earlier point I made, which is that you can affect a difference to global climate by actions anywhere in the world. And people who are industrialized have some of the biggest responsibility to do it. So I'm optimistic from that perspective as well. You've got to keep the faith, otherwise, what's the point?
So thank you. We have about 4 minutes to wrap up. And so just, I'd like maybe some 30-second thoughts from everybody before we close. But I just want to point out how digital has come up in terms of how we harness that, in terms of modeling what we need to do and making it inclusive. And this idea of timelines. Net zero, you know, it's 2050. And so how do we work on the short, medium, and long term? So last thoughts? Start with you, Mark.
Always my response to those sort of timeline questions is, and we, again, just from personal research, if you're interested in the future, visioning the future and so forth, that's excellent. But the future is with us today. You know, the future is being created through regulatory frameworks, through culture, through livelihood practices, through ambitions and aspirations. So don't wait for the future. You know, it's always going to, if you think about the future as being ahead of you, it will never arrive. The future is now, and we can act on it. So I think that's my timelines piece. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Catherine?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, in addition to that, which I fully agree with, I think the other thing to consider is that we all have a role to play. And I think sometimes it's easy to talk about what other people should be doing to change things, but we all have responsibility to change things ourselves and change our way of seeing, change our way of doing, all those kind of things as well. So I think my hope that we can do all of this is accompanied by a belief that we all need to keep doing as much as we can to move forward. Thanks.
Susan?
Thank you. For some reason, I can't hear Mark and Catherine, despite advocating the great technology. So I might repeat what they say, and I'm therefore going to keep it really short because it's an aspect that I haven't brought up so far, but others have. I think that transdisciplinary research is really important. And, you know, in net zero, we're not just tackling it from a natural environmental research council, because if the knowledge isn't translated or we don't understand the cultural aspects that we talked about earlier, it will be ineffective. So I didn't advocate it before, but transdisciplinary research is also really important.
Lancelot?
Thank you, Eliane. And I would just maybe first of all repeat what Mark was just mentioning about the future, because this is something that is really important to me. You know, sometimes when you talk about the future, it's like it will happen tomorrow, but the future is now. And if you're not considering today, we will miss something. That is what it is important to work on solutions applicable today to make sure that we will have a future tomorrow, actually. And having that in mind, what is important also to do in short term is to increase the possibility to engage decision makers, to make sure that research is accessible to people in the ground, to increase knowledge brokering opportunities, because we have a lot of research already available, but very less work done in terms of making sure that this research is accessible and implemented, actually, because the implementation is another dimension that is really important to consider when we are talking about short, medium, and long term of climate adaptation. Thank you, Eliane.
Oh, this has been a really powerful session. We know that as we are looking, the effects of climate change are devastating all over the world, and people continue to die. And so we have to raise our ambitions. The future is now. We need to act now. We need to act collectively. We need to act as inclusively as possible. And we need to harness all knowledge systems to make sure that in this emerging process of finding solutions of how we will create a future where generations to come can have a life better than ours, that we really collectively bring our collective intelligence together into a planetary intelligence framework so we can deal with the difficult issues we have, not only climate, but also shocks such as the pandemic. So I just like to thank our panelists that really did an amazing job in terms of informing us. And I also would like to say thank you to our audience for being here and for the wonderful questions you've asked us. So thank you, everyone, and wishing you a great rest of the day. Bye.